In 2012, Capcom graced the world with Dragon's Dogma, a classic fantasy RPG with a healthy injection of the characteristic Capcom style of combat, found in other games like Devil May Cry. Its development had had issues, resulting in large portions of planned content missing from the game. Nevertheless, it became a cult classic, loved for its gameplay, graphics and music, but also, I argue, its story's themes. The mark of a deep story is that people will be drawn to it, even without knowing why. Its symbolism speaks to something profound indirectly, but so well that people feel its message, even when they cannot put their finger on or explain it. I believe a good portion of Dragon's Dogma's success is from the fact that its mythos and story carry this kind of depth. In this video, I will attempt to explain the deeper meaning of this incredible game and the many ideas it draws upon. Now, while the details of the meaning of Dragon's Dogma's story are not obvious, its overall themes are crystal clear. They consist of two basic influences. On the one hand, Dragon's Dogma is a classic fantasy story. A nobody from a small village takes up arms and grows strong enough to eventually defeat an evil dragon and save the world. But on the other hand, Dragon's Dogma is simultaneously a myth symbolic of overcoming nihilism, finding new meaning in a seemingly meaningless world, all inspired by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, whose work is focused entirely on the struggle to do just that. Now, while I am going to be speculating somewhat about the meaning of this game, perhaps beyond the intention of the game's writers, I want to make it clear that this connection to Nietzsche is no leap of logic on my part. The game contains repeated mentions of will and strength of will, which feature heavily in Nietzsche's philosophy, and the main theme song of the game is called Eternal Return, which references the infinite cycle of Dragon's Dogma's universe, and both of these directly refer to a concept Nietzsche spoke about called eternal recurrence. These two elements, along with a small element of dying gods, is enough to establish the connection explicitly. However, with this basis to work from, I will now explain how the game communicates its themes more subtly. It does this in the same way that all stories do, especially religious myth, through symbolism. Before I go any further and start rattling on about symbolism this and symbolism that, it's best if I explained what symbolism is and how it works, so I don't sound like a total schizo. Nowadays, we highly prize the explanation of things. We want to put everything in explicit and literal terms, laid out with all the information we need coming straight from the words presented. In the modern day, this is perfectly possible to do with some effort and care, especially in English, because we have a wide array of words to draw upon, all with pretty clear meanings. However, this is only possible now because of millennia of struggle where this was not possible, with people having to come up with the words required whenever they found the concepts necessary to talk about. Even just 1,000 years ago, terms were much more vague, poorly defined, and fewer in number, but this was especially the case before we had philosophy or any other intellectual tradition. But words are not necessary to come upon an insight into human life and existence, and so religious figures of the past did so despite being unable to directly explain what they'd learned. The difficulty of explaining these ideas is even greater in these cases, given the lofty and abstract ideals religions often deal with. Now, consider, how do you communicate without words? Well, before language, we would have had to communicate through demonstration, acting out analogies with our actions or non-linguistic sounds, in order to hint at the things that we meant. For instance, if you wanted to hunt down a lion, you might imitate the motions involved in stabbing with a spear, and then stand on all fours and roar like a lion. Well, the idea of symbolism is that you can put this kind of enacted analogy inside explicit explanations. Although perhaps not an example of symbolism, a good example of this idea is one we can still see today in almost all modern media. We're all familiar with how the protagonist of a story is made to seem like the good guy, and how we come to root for them and wish for their success, often regardless or even in spite of whether what they do is actually good. The story doesn't need to tell us that the protagonist is good, and rarely does, but the way it frames and sets up events is enough to communicate that idea to us as the reader or viewer. The primary method of real symbolism, though, is the idea of creating figures like gods, people or creatures that possess several different traits, all associated with a single, more abstract concept, and then having them interact with the world or other such figures to demonstrate how these abstract ideas should relate to each other, or more importantly, how we as individuals ought to relate to them ourselves. It's through this that all the mythologies of the world likely arose. And this becomes clearer when you look at the etymologies of many gods' names, although they are often literally just a concept, like the god Phobos in Greek mythology. That is the name of the god of fear, but the word itself simply means fear. Going back to the method of symbolism, the best and most important example of it is the great mythological motif found across the world, the Chaoskampf, the struggle against chaos. Chaoskampf, or Chaoskampf, which means struggle against chaos in German, is an ancient and widely occurring mythological motif across Eurasia. The basic idea of this story is of a hero, often a god of war or thunder, battling some kind of serpentine monster associated with water and fire, usually after it has begun to steal or destroy things. This monster is often called a dragon, and of course this is what gave rise to the more specific conception of the winged, fire-breathing reptilian monster found all across modern fantasy. Whether or not you've heard of this idea before, stop and think. What in the world do dragons or serpents have to do with chaos? Why would we associate the two? Well, in order to answer that question, we must come to understand what chaos itself is, and to do that, we must also understand order, its opposite. Let's look first at chaos. Today, the word refers to a kind of frenetic activity, which of course contrasts with order, which is rigidity and stillness. However, while still related to it, this meaning of chaos is actually different to the original meaning of the term. This originally Greek word referred to the state that preceded the world itself, which was not a maelstrom of activity, but rather a vast emptiness. Linguistic analysis shows that this word is related to the other ancient Greek words, kaskor and kaino, which mean gape or be wide open, as well as the English word gape itself and the word gap, which to this day still refers to an empty space. Hence, the original sense of chaos, and what I'd argue is the underlying meaning of chaos even now, is that of absence and negation. Even the sense of frenetic activity plays into this, as when things move around, when they change, the previous state has been continuously negated, nullified, voided. In order to move, one must leave behind empty space where one once was. Then, as we mentioned, order is the opposite of chaos. So with chaos being absence, order is therefore presence. Instead of activity, order is therefore stillness, unmoving, unchanging. But there is one last point to a discussion of order and chaos. These ideas are ultimately thought of within and presented to a particular human perspective. And thus, even when order and chaos aren't quote-unquote objectively there, they can still apply to things as they appear from someone's perspective. The question of whether something is present or absent, for example, is often not the true question. Often, it's actually a question of whether we know that something is present or absent. If we know or believe that it is there, then in our perspective, it is there, and we will behave as if it is. But if we do not know, if we are ignorant, then from our perspective, it is not there. To take another step in this direction, let's say something else. If we feel as if we know how things work, then we feel as if everything is in order. Correspondingly, if we feel as if we don't know how things work, then we feel as if everything is chaotic. Thus, what we know feels like order to us, and thus what is unknown to us feels like chaos to us, regardless of its objective nature and regardless of how others may view it. Now let's remember what I said about how to make a symbol of an abstract concept. You create a figure that has traits that are all associated with and exemplify that concept. If we look at the traits of a dragon, we find that it's very clearly a symbol of chaos. First of all, dragons breathe fire. Fire is in constant motion and hard to control and predict, as well as destructive. We'll explain what destruction has to do with chaos in a moment. Secondly, dragons are reptilian. On its face, any reptilian creature is chaotic to human beings because they are so utterly unlike us, different to the mammalian creatures we spend time around, most obviously in how they lack fur or hair, as well as their behaviour and lack of warmth. This is why, originally, there were no dragons, and these myths involved slaying a giant snake of some kind. Snakes' defining trait is in how they bend and change constantly as they move. We discussed how change is chaotic, but I won't go into detail about how curves are chaotic, as it's quite complicated. Regardless, I think it'll make intuitive sense to you that curves are chaos, as opposed to straight lines being order. Thirdly, dragons are really weird. While serpents and snakes are weird to us, they are actually real, and so we do actually see them now and again. By contrast, dragons are totally unlike anything a human being would ever see. They have 6 limbs instead of 4, and in Dragon's Dogma in particular, this goes a step further by giving the dragon far more fingers in its wings than the 5 digits one would expect. The fact it breathes fire is also very weird, and the monsters that enter the world whenever the dragon arrives in Dragon's Dogma are also this way. Weirdness is ultimately when things are unknown in some way, either because they're unfamiliar or because we simply do not understand them. Finally, dragons are destructive. Destruction means things changing, for one, which again we've established as chaotic, but also means things entering a state that is not expected or intended of them. When a building has been smashed to pieces, it does not behave as you would expect a house to behave anymore, on top of its behaviour being erratic, such as the fact it may collapse at any moment. By being destroyed, it's also stopped really being what it was, which goes back to how chaos is related to being negated. So finally, after all that explanation, it should now make sense why the struggle against chaos can be represented so well by a battle against a dragon. There shall be more about order and chaos to come, but before we can continue, we must contend with the other key theme I mentioned that can be found in Dragon's Dogma. That of Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas, namely the struggle against nihilism. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher who lived during the 19th century. His famous proclamation was that of the death of God, with which he was referring to the encroaching and eventually total inability of the European world to believe in the God of Christianity, the keystone of its values and value systems. He also asserted that as a result of this, the Western world would experience a great crisis, the crisis of nihilism, or as we may call it today, a meaning crisis. To understand what this means, we must of course understand nihilism. In philosophy, nihilism technically is a kind of attitude toward any given domain of thought or knowledge, in which one gives denial as one's answer to the question. For instance, there is the philosophical domain of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, or what makes it justified to believe in things. An epistemological nihilist, therefore, is someone who denies that there can ever be such thing as justified belief or knowledge. Then you have ethics, the study of right and wrong conduct. An ethical nihilist would be someone who denies that one can make any claims about anything being right or wrong. However, when we simply say the word nihilism, we're referring by default to a specific kind called existential nihilism, which is the idea that life is without meaning, purpose, or any value at all. Anyone who's paying attention can see that Nietzsche's predictions were more or less correct. Those in the modern world, although now not just the Western world, struggle to give answers to the questions of what gives life meaning, purpose, or value. Or, at the very least, they struggle to understand how their own life could have these things. And so, what makes Dragon's Dogma so compelling is that it is speaking to the spirit of these present times. Now, these two themes may initially seem like two parallel currents, separate to each other and coexisting in the same narrative. However, those who've been paying close attention will be able to tell that the chaos camp, the struggle against chaos, and the struggle against nihilism are the same struggle. The struggle against nihilism is an example of the struggle against chaos. So does that make nihilism a kind of chaos? Of course it does. As I explained, no matter the domain, nihilism is the denial of any real or possible conclusions in that domain. Or should I say, a total negation of the possibility of knowledge, making the domain a total unknown. A total and complete absence of meaning, purpose and value in one's life from one's own perspective. Indeed, this is not merely my observation. The very concept of nihilism was named with this in mind. It is derived from the Latin word nihil, which means nothing, a concept which is nothing less than the absence of anything. And so we see that in some sense, the dragon of Dragon's Dogma is not just a representative of chaos, but of the chaos that is a crisis of nihilism. However, the best example of why the dragon is a representation of nihilism can be seen in just one specific element that Dragon's Dogma adds to the classic Chaos Camp formula. Before the modern era, it was very common to believe that the heart was the seat of the soul, the mind, the spirit. And we see this still today in phraseology like, I love you with all my heart, and saying that we know in our heart that such and such a thing is true or false. But back then, and indeed still today, we see a greater association here with the spirit rather than the mind or intellect, with passion and motivation rather than cold belief about how things work. And so it is reasonable to say that the heart has long been associated with the part of the human being that comprehends the value in things, and thus the part of the human being that feels the meaning and purpose of life, or lack thereof.
Io acquarata mesquierait. Acquarata de fiomi. Mi esquarota conto la
And thus appears the dragon Grigori, the symbol of chaos, the great unknown, the presence of nihilism in the world. A certain individual catches his eye, and he steals their heart, and most importantly, swallows it. Need I even explain? What could it mean that the symbol of chaos has swallowed the seat of one's sense of meaning, purpose, and value in life? This single element makes it so obvious that nihilism is the theme of this game, by representing, of course, an individual person falling into nihilism. Their spirit has been consumed by, fallen into, chaos. Correspondingly, the dragon of our world, in our age, is nihilism. Like a dragon, it is destructive, and not just because many nihilists come to be destructive themselves, but because of the nature of nihilism, its effect on our worldviews, the way it leads to their degradation. As I have explained, nihilism is when one denies that life has meaning, purpose, or value. But another way of saying this, referring back to what I said about perspectives, is that nihilism is when one denies the possibility of any justified assertion of meaning, purpose, or value. What's the difference? Well, because justification is the same as something like reasoning, and not the values themselves necessarily. Nihilism and nihilists do not deny that values exist, they simply deny that they have any justification, because they think that such a thing is impossible. Nihilists may and always do continue having values. And why does this matter? Well, for two reasons. The first is that the reasoning and justification for a system of values is its lifeblood. Not only do values come into existence because of reasoning and justification, and thus could not exist without them, but more importantly, they cannot continue to exist without reasoning and justification either. Your values may persist for a time despite your lack of a justification for them, but sooner or later they will begin to crumble as they contradict themselves and the world, and as your consciousness becomes unable to deny their complete lack of a basis. The second is that one's values ultimately determine one's attentional patterns. We form our whole worldview from how we look at the world, and how we look at the world is nothing more than how we pay attention to it. Thus, without a justification for values, they begin to crumble. As our values begin to crumble, so too does the way of looking at the world that we have to make sense of it. And as it ceases to make sense, our mind, not just our spirit, has fallen into chaos. So, from the individual person's perspective, their worldview begins to destroy itself, and along with it, their sense of the world itself. This is how nihilism is like the dragon of the real world. Just as the dragon destroys the world of Dragon's Dogma, nihilism destroys our world views. Simply look at the constant claims of imminent doom and apocalypse in the world today, and you'll see how this feeling is creeping into our collective psyche. With the world and its people threatened by the dragon of nihilism, a response must be given, lest the world be completely destroyed. The main and idealized response is that of the true arisen, who sees things through to the completion of the game, characterized by their strength of will. Next time, we'll explore the various responses to the dragon, and how they correspond to responses to nihilism, along with the key concept of Nietzsche's philosophy, the will to power. If you appreciated this video, please like and subscribe to support me.